Morning, everyone. Firstly, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone for joining this session, Neurodiversity, the time is now. Hopefully we're going to get a good mix of attendees today, from neurodivergent individuals to those who perhaps aren't so familiar with neurodiversity and want to learn more. So everyone's welcome. My name is Rob Davies. I co-chair the Diversity Project's Neurodiversity workstream with Jennifer Matthews. I have a personal interest in neurodiversity. I'm a parent of a 16-year-old son who was diagnosed with Asperger's when he was 3. I wanted to get involved to ensure talents of people like my son, whose brain functions at a considerably higher level than my own, are fully realised. The reality is that neurodiversity is a relatively untapped and underutilised area within society and our industry, and we want that to change. Clearly, there's a fairness aspect to that, but it also makes sense for commercial reasons. Neurodiversity provides access to new skills and perspectives and distinct talents, and which business wouldn't want to access those? So very simply, neurodiversity describes differences in the way human brains are wired. While the idea of a neurotypical brain is somewhat a little ridiculous because we're all wired differently, neurodiversity specifically refers to conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. Today's session is going to be in 2 parts. So first, I'm going to host a panel discussion with 2 neurodiversity champions who are going to share their thoughts on how we can make the industry more inclusive. And second, we're going to hear from 4 neurodivergent members of our work stream who are going to share with you their stories and experiences. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. I think hopefully this is all done for you, but if not, if you can all put yourselves on mute during this session, that would be appreciated. And secondly, if you've got any questions, please add them into the chat. We'll try and get through as many as possible at the end. And if you want to direct a question to one of our speakers today, please can you specify in your question who it's for. So let's crack on. I'm delighted to be joined for the first session by Ian Eyston and Laurie Edmonds. So Ian is a senior HR practitioner and long-standing neurodiversity advocate who I first heard speaking on this topic a few years ago. Laurie's worked in our industry for many years and is here in his capacity as co-chair of the Group for Autism, Insurance, Investment and Neurodiversity, GAIN for short. GAIN is doing fantastic work to promote and counsel bad businesses on neuro inclusion in our industry. So first question, I think it would be good for everybody to hear how you both became aware of and involved with neurodiversity. Ian, if we can start with you.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everybody. I first became involved in neurodiversity for a combination of reasons. Like yourself, I have children who have been diagnosed. I have one child that's autistic and dyspraxic, and another child who is autistic and dyslexic. At the same time, I was asked on a couple of occasions in my capacity as HR director to fire a number of employees in the business I was working for. And when I investigated the circumstances, it turned out that they were neurodivergent individuals and there'd been a breakdown between them and their manager, and it wasn't their fault or their manager's fault. It was actually the organization's fault for not having recognized and done enough to train both parties. So that got me very, very interested to think about how many other circumstances might there be where organizations can help to improve the opportunity for employment for neurodiverse people.
Thank you, Ian. What about you, Laurie?
Well, as you said, Rob, I'm an industry lifer. I've done most jobs from doing the filing to company chair, including chairing a very early SRI fund management business in the 90s. But I became, because a friend of mine had an autistic daughter, a trustee of a school for autistic children back nearly 20 years ago now. And we realized as the children aged that there was a black hole when they got to employment at the age of 18. And that black hole isn't just a black hole then. We've realized that only 1 in 5 autistic people, and the numbers aren't that much better for some other forms of neurodiversity, is a continuing theme throughout life. In businesses, I became increasingly aware, I've been non-exec directing for the last 10 years, of talent gaps, especially as data becomes king. So what it's putting all that together, we realize there's a match between underused neurodiverse talent and the talent needs of the industry. And so we set up GAIN to radically improve the employment prospects of neurodiverse people in our industry. We're not for profit, and we exist only because of the talent gap. We would like to make ourselves redundant.
Okay, thank you both. Ian, maybe we can sort of turn back to you on, and why is neuro inclusion so important in the workplace?
Thanks. I think there are lots of reasons, but I'd probably pull out 3 that stand out for me. First and foremost, you touched on it. I think we've got a moral and ethical responsibility to include individuals that otherwise don't get included. I think secondly, up until very recently, neurodiversity has been significantly under-recognised and underappreciated in the workplace. And even when there was some understanding, it was often misunderstood. There is a huge amount of stereotypes and biases, some conscious, some unconscious, that people have about aspects of neurodiversity, and therefore creating more inclusion would help to challenge all of that. And I think thirdly, and I think you touched on it in the introduction, it's just so important for all of us in all aspects of life, employment, society, because we have so much talent that is potentially either underutilized or just not employed because historically the system hasn't been set up to be inclusive of neurodiverse people.
Thank you, Ian. Laurie,
Yeah.
Why should employers care about neuro inclusion?
Well, as Ian has said, from the individual's perspective and from a societal perspective, I think it's pretty clear. From an employer's perspective, which is where I found myself throughout my career with more bottom lines than a bloody zebra, I think the business case is clear. There's a shortage of the talent the industry needs. It's not just our industry, but I think it's particularly the case in our industry because we are so dependent on data and on processes that work really clearly. But generally, of course, the number of people who are seeking employment in the country overall has fallen below the number of job vacancies for the first time ever. We've been reading even in recent days about the Great Resignation, and there's specifically a real shortage of tech skills. So there are talent gaps in our sector which underused neurodiverse people can fill. As Ian said, autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic people all bring with them abilities and attributes which our industry needs. But the match between those talents and the needs of our sector isn't generally being made. There are a few honourable exceptions. For example, I'm very aware of some work that Columbia Threadneedle and of Fidelity are doing that are great exemplars. So it's not just about filling vacancies, though, and being able to get work done at an optimum cost. In my business I've just stood down from, we have a big data transition problem to do. We can't find the people, so we're paying consultants arm and a leg to do stuff which we would rather have employees doing. From a business perspective, if there's a case for diversity because of diversity of thoughts to avoid groupthink, etc., then where more so is there a case for diversity than in neurodiversity. But it's also a question of getting the best out of your workforce. Productivity, a recent Harvard Business Review showed that if you can get an autistic person into a role which really fits them, they can be 140%, that's 140% more productive than a neurotypical person. And Secondly, masking and camouflaging is hugely destroys a lot of capability. There's a massive uplift which has been measured in the stress and mental health issues faced by people through camouflaging. So it really comes down to, what would you rather have? A workforce with talent gaps in key places, a workforce with suboptimal productivity, a workforce with increasing and unnecessary stress and tension, or one which doesn't have any of those. And the adjustments which have to be made to deal with them aren't huge. They're more attitude and understanding than they are expensive. I think the business case is clear, and that's what we again are trying to do something about.
I think you've made, both of you made kind of, some compelling arguments about the case for, in light of that, why has neurodiversity to date been such an untapped talent pool? Ian, again, if we can start with you.
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons why it's been untapped to date. Unlike other aspects of difference in people's makeup, neurodiversity is often hidden. At least initially, it can be hidden, so it's not as obvious. It's not somebody sat in a wheelchair or using a guide dog for blind, so it can get missed. I think also the combination of the fact that there are a number of existing stereotypes which significantly underappreciate just how diverse neurodiversity itself is. There's a real danger that when people and organizations start to understand one person that's got some element of neurodiversity, they kind of apply that to everybody. And actually what I've learned, I've just recently completed a doctorate looking at this subject, and what I really found that I'd not appreciated before is just the huge variety of different aspects of neurodiversity, and therefore I think that's a significant reason why it's been untapped so far. I think also as a result of all of that, or perhaps causing some of that, organizations have provided less education and less training about this aspect of diversity and inclusion than they have almost any other aspect of diversity and inclusion. I've worked in HR, as you said, for the last 20 years, and whilst you always can improve, the amount of work that's gone into some aspects of diversity training has been huge. It's been much less in terms of neurodiversity, and therefore it goes untapped. And I think also, going back one step further, we mustn't forget that many of us talked about the fact that we first became aware of neurodiversity because of children. Unfortunately, the education system is currently generally very poor at coping with neurodivergent individuals, and therefore often people have their education affected by that, come out of the education system with fewer qualifications than actually they are capable of, and therefore inevitably in a system that's driven by a neurotypical approach, very standardized recruitment tends to disadvantage neurodiverse people, and they just don't get the airtime and the opportunities that others might.
Thank you, Ian. Laurie, any thoughts from you?
Well, absolutely, Ian. I agree with every syllable of that, but therefore won't repeat it. But it is, we believe, because it's not as obvious as other forms of diversity, it's not been realised until relatively recently, so it doesn't stand up there at the moment alongside gender and ethnicity and the other forms of important diversification. And the evidence of that is sort of fairly clear, particularly perhaps in our sector. Earlier this year, Portfolio Institutional magazine launched a diversity hub, which is a great thing to do, and it's a great piece of work. But in the launch material, neurodiversity wasn't even mentioned. Just this week, McKinsey have published a great article about the problems of getting tech talent. They describe the characteristics of the kind of talent needed and the difficulties in getting it, the alignment of the needs that they described and the abilities and attributes of many of those varieties of neurodiverse people that you've referred to, Ian, screams at you off the page. But did they make the connection? No, they didn't make the connection. They walked right up to the front door, but they never knocked on it. So it is a question of recognition. And then why is it untapped in practice? Ian, as you touched on, recruitment and appraisal processes are generally not very well set up to address to get the best out of neurodiverse people. They can be there are a number of people. I see a question in the chat which I'd love to answer in more detail, but we don't have the time, about what are the recruitment processes to be made more inclusive. There's a lot of information and expertise on that. One of the most crucial things, though, alongside getting the processes straight, is getting the understanding of managers, supervisors, and crucially colleagues to be sensitized to the issue, because the masking problem is one of the biggest ones of this. And so getting everybody around is key.
Yeah, thank you. You know, one of the things we try and do in our work stream, you know, one of our big areas of focus is on raising awareness, because it's amazing how, I guess, knowledge of neurodiversity and understanding of it is actually quite limited in a lot of cases, not in all cases, but in some cases. But for change to happen, we really need to move from awareness to action. So, you know, just as a last sort of question to you both, and Ian, I think maybe we can touch from your HR, with your HR hat on, you know, what can and should HR teams and businesses do to foster neuro inclusion? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And again, it builds on a lot of the stuff that Laurie's just said, but I guess I'd start with education and training for colleagues, line managers, just for people to understand. I think, yeah, definitely more inclusive recruitment. You know, Hannah asked the question in the thing about what can you do. There is a whole load of things you've done. I mean, I won't bore you with it, but I wrote about 100 pages on it in my doctorate. But you know, for example, one of the other businesses I work in is a recruitment business, and the only reason I'm working with them is because they use a selection tool that is unlike most of the other selection tools that exist, that are currently very neurotypical biased and biased against neurodiverse people. And so there are tools that you can use that can be very helpful. Also, just going into any recruitment process with an attitude that says, how will I make it inclusive for people that are neurodiverse? And if you recognize that probably less than a third of neurodiverse people disclose during recruitment processes that they are, it's no good just saying, well, I asked the question and they didn't say anything. You've got to go more than that. You've got to be proactive. I think also we're starting to see really clever organizations include neurodiverse people within this debate themselves. So where you've got people that have disclosed internally, get them involved in recruitment, get them involved in publications so that you can get their much better insightful view on how things should be. In a couple of organizations that I've worked in the industry, we've created affinity groups and staff networks that have spun off from other staff networks so that people particularly can focus on neurodiversity. And I think the other thing I would say is that many organizations fall into the trap of saying, yes, we'll make reasonable adjustments available, but then they make the financial and procedural processes so darn difficult that the individual and the line manager give up before they even get it, or just adds to the levels of stress. So don't just say you've got reasonable adjustments, actually make it work for people. Okay, I could go on, but we haven't got time.
That's great advice, and it's good to see we have got some questions coming through in the thread. We'll try and get to as many of those as possible, but yeah, we've got to run to time. So Laurie, just from an industry perspective, you know, what do you think businesses should be doing? I think, you know, Ian's just made some sort of powerful cases about what some HR teams can do, line managers, colleagues, and training. Anything else that you'd add?
Well, number one, recognize the issues are a business opportunity, not a CSR or even an HR one. It's a business opportunity. Secondly, as Ian said, look at those employment practices, recruitment, appraisal, especially. Third, in practical terms, carry out a benchmark review of how your current practices compare against those which are best practice and against others in the industry. and then get input, which is widely available on the adjustments that are needed. I mean, the benchmarking process is one which GAIN has specifically set itself up to do. We're not going to do it ourselves. Sorry, we're going to carry out an initial sort of triage ourselves. We're only a tiny organization, one full-time employee. We may grow to 2, but what we are is a hub that we know where the people are that can provide these services and answer some of the questions popping up on the chat. So what we can do is make the connections. We can do an initial assessment. We can make the connections to organizations that have the expertise, and we're building a pool of neurodiverse talents for businesses to be able to draw on. What we'd like to do, we've got a great group of corporate sponsors, including Aviva, Zurich, Marsh and Mercer's, Principal, Pensions Insurance Corporation, Just Group only just joined this morning, I'm delighted to say. We'd like to see some more people from the Investment Association join, so that basically we can make neurodiverse friendly, it's not quite the right word, but you know what I mean, make it just the ordinary way of life is one in which neurodiverse people can thrive like others can.
Thank you both. I think it's really sort of fascinating insights. And again, I note that we've got a lot of questions coming through. If we don't get round to them today, we promise that we will come back to you individually and address any sort of questions. But thank you, Ian. Thank you, Laurie. Really great discussion, and thanks for both participating. We're now going to move on to hear from members of our neurodiversity workstream. Now, stories are a great way to form connections and build understanding, and I hope listening to our next 4 speakers is going to give you a little bit more insight on neurodiversity. We're going to hear first from David Kendicks, who's going to talk a little on disclosure, reasonable adjustments, and also offer what I think is a compelling argument for neurodiversity to employers. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. My personal experiences can only really reflect my particular flavour of neurodiversity, which is autism. But through mentoring other neurodiverse people within and outside my company, I've picked up a pretty good second-hand understanding of what it's like to have ADHD or dyslexia. The challenges faced in the workplace will vary hugely depending on whether you try to hide your neurodiversity or whether you're open about it and seek support and understanding from others. Now, you might expect me to say that being open is better and means fewer challenges, but that's not necessarily the case. If the business culture or your manager or your close colleagues are not supportive, then coming out, if I can call it that, can be worse than hiding it. An HR director I knew, when asked a few years back to consider recruiting more autistic people, replied, "No, we don't want those sort of people here." More recently, after one of my mentees decided to disclose their neurodiversity to their boss, the response was to exclude them from career development opportunities with lines such as, "I don't want you leading these client engagements as, given your autism, you won't feel socially comfortable doing so." Now, I hope these attitudes are becoming less common, and webinars like this can surely help move the dial. So hopefully disclosure will be seen to be a helpful first step. What's meant by disclosure is a separate matter. Ticking a box on your HR profile won't achieve anything by itself, of course, especially if to do so, you need to classify yourself as disabled. Now, some neurodiverse people will fulfill the legal definition of disabled, others won't. But more importantly, regardless of the legal position, many neurodiverse people will not want to identify themselves as disabled. Indeed, quite the opposite. They see the differences in their skill sets as an attribute, their USP, or even their superpower. This, for me, is at the core of recognizing and valuing neurodiverse colleagues. The realization that subtle changes in neurological wirings will lead to a person with a spikier profile. There will be some things we won't do well or even at all that everyone else seems to do effortlessly. But this is compensated by unusually high skill levels in other areas. What's more, these skills, as we just heard, are ones that employers should really value. Unusually high levels of creativity, concentration, problem solving, spotting anomalies. Different neurodiverse people bring different skills, but only, of course, if their colleagues can see past the things that they don't do so well. So if your autistic colleague seems to lack the social skills to engage effortlessly in small talk, this might be compensated by them noticing some crucial flaw in a document or in a formula that have passed everyone else by. Early in my career, long before I'd heard of neurodiversity, let alone been diagnosed, the senior manager said to my boss, "This looks like the sort of problem where we need to stick Kendix in a room for a week and he'll come up with a solution. And even if he doesn't, at least we would have stuck him in a room for a week." Little could either of us have imagined it, but this manager was pioneering the idea of making reasonable adjustments in order to harness neurodiverse talent. Some of us struggle to concentrate with background noises, whether from other conversations, phone calls, or perhaps even the hum of air conditioning. Some of us can hyperfocus if we can be freed from competing activities. So yes, shutting me in a room probably was the best way to get the problem solved. There is one organisation that's well known for being years ahead of everyone else. Here is a headline from The Independent from a few years ago. GCHQ targeting neurodiverse people in recruitment drive. With a right mix of minds, anything is possible, Spy Chief says. And indeed, GCHQ is rightly proud of their high proportion of hires who are dyslexic or autistic. And this isn't because they want to be seen as promoting diversity. Rather, as their strategy director put it, we're looking for people who can see something that's out of place in a bigger picture and can spot anomalies. Our country's security depends on it. My point is that our employers may well say that respecting diversity in all its forms is the right thing to do, and they realise that making reasonable adjustments to those with disabilities is a legal requirement, but that's not why they should be committed to providing a welcoming and supportive environment for neurodiverse colleagues. It's because these people will often prove to be a hugely loyal and highly value-adding part of the workforce. A few weeks ago, a colleague received a work call from a member of her team at 8 o'clock one evening while having dinner. With no preliminaries, the caller dived straight into a work question. She interrupted him. "Were you going to ask whether this is a convenient time to talk?" she said. No, he replied, before continuing with his work question. At the end of the call, her attitude towards her direct report was far from positive, despite him being technically very strong. Then the light bulb moment. Socially unaware, doesn't do small talk, and answers questions far too literally. So without even discussing his likely autism, he is now managed by her in a subtly different way that allows his professional skills to shine through, but without his social skills proving to be a barrier. So why this story? Well, this manager was one of the first people to whom I disclosed and explained what autism was. For all the policies that can be drafted, webinars arranged, or pages placed on the company intranet, for me, the biggest single step change that an employer can do to be more neuro-inclusive is for line managers to know what to look for and how to respond. So what are the right responses? Well, it will depend on the individual, of course. It might relate to how often they can work from home, or how their workload is structured, or how often they seek guidance or support. In other words, all the things a good manager should think about anyway. So much for supporting your neurodiverse colleagues. What about helping to flourish, not just to cope? My final appeal concerns how the performance of neurodiverse colleagues is measured. It typically uses scorecards that simply fail to recognise that a spiky profile will lead to what appears to be a mixture of over and underperformance. One of my mentees came up with this analogy that I really liked. I am colourblind. Every year, my manager puts in my personal appraisal that I need to work on my ability to distinguish between red and green. She tells me to work harder on it, and that with enough practice and determination, I can reach the expected standard. But until then, my career can't progress, even though judging colours plays no part in my job. So, if you judge a person on whether they are a team player, or whether they embrace change, or whatever criterion a colleague makes you feel comfortable, then maybe it's time to stop and ask yourself if you're actually judging their differences rather than their abilities. Through the Diversity Project and elsewhere, our industry has made huge progress in being inclusive in so many ways, and my appeal is that neurodiversity now has a chance to join the party. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was excellent. We're now going to move on to Nalini Solanki, who is a business manager and chairs the Neurodiversity Network at her employers. And she is going to talk to us on how disclosure can change the narrative. Nalini, over to you.
Hi. So every year, end of performance review time would come, and I'd hear the same thing. Great performance, but you really need to raise your profile a bit more. Be more vocal in meetings. Why don't you take the next 12 months to really focus on that? And then come back and we'll discuss how you can progress to the next level. And off I'd go again on yet another executive presence workshop. But being a self-starter, I was always chasing a challenge. I found no problem in expanding my role and responsibilities. So this progress, it was only on paper. I had a seat at all the right tables, but I couldn't quite nail those vocal skills that signal I have presence in a meeting, and no amount of RADA coaching was ever going to change that. Impressions, as we know, are formed in the first 30 seconds. Now you imagine a meeting. What does good performance look like to you? It's having presence. It's being heard. It's actively participating. But what about that one person who never seems to contribute? They're always quiet. Are they engaged? Are they even paying attention? Perception is so important, isn't it? Imagine all those years then, I berated myself, frustrated at not being able to put in practice all the things I knew I needed to do, but I failed at again and again, and the damage that this does to your self-esteem. This is what happens if you're neurodiverse and you're trying to succeed in an environment that's designed for neurotypical minds. With standard measures for performance and capabilities, it really does feel like you're trying to bash a square peg into a round hole. But getting an ADHD diagnosis and choosing to disclose this, that took courage. Not only because you lay bare all your vulnerabilities, but because there's so little awareness. You're constantly being told, however well-intended, not to be so ridiculous. Everyone feels like that or does that. Doesn't mean you have ADHD, as if you're not already feeling like an imposter. And yes, everyone does sometimes do that or feel like that. But if you have ADHD, you do that and you feel like that every single day, all the time. You don't get a day off. Fortunately, though, we're a very resilient bunch. We've had to face challenges and setbacks pretty much all our lives. And this is the reason you'll find that we're your problem solvers in every workplace you go to. And when there's a crisis, we really do come into our own. It takes a neurodiverse person, though, up to 30 seconds longer to process what's being said. So if I was to remain silent now for 30 seconds, you'd see how long that can feel like. But let's go back to that meeting. By the time I'm ready to put across my point of view, the discussion has already moved on, and so it's no longer timely. Add to this that I've usually got 5 different, totally unrelated thoughts running through my mind at once. I'm trying so hard to steer my mind back to the conversation. Sorry, what did you just say? That's probably my most common phrase used. But this is what inattentive and hyperactive ADHD looks like. It's not a racing child bouncing off the walls. It's a grown adult with a racing mind that doesn't pay attention. The meeting isn't boring. You're not boring me. I'm interested in what you're saying, honest. It's just that I lack the capacity to maintain focus just as well as you do. It might be annoying for you, but it frustrates me far more. But all these traits are strengths, and they're of huge value to business. We'd like to be super organised because we struggle so much with organising ourselves, thanks to an impairment with executive function in the ADHD brain. We take copious notes and we use coloured pens and post-it notes on the back of doors so that we don't forget the important details, because anything out of sight is really out of mind. But that's why we adapt to change so easily when others find it unsettling. Whenever there's a restructure, we're the ones that lead the way, helping new team structures to form. Choosing to disclose means that I can now help shape that narrative. Meetings have clear agendas. Participants can feed back their thoughts and suggestions after the meeting, once they've had a chance to digest what's been discussed. And key performance indicators are already starting to be reviewed to recognise that there are many ways in which presence can be and should be measured. And thankfully, presenteeism is no longer a thing. Now that I've disclosed, I no longer feel hemmed in by the 9 to 5, using up my energy trying to stay focused in an environment that's full of distractions. I do have the ability to hyper-focus for hours. They may not be your working hours when I have those light bulb moments though, spotting things that others may have missed. And once we start to move away from these standard performance measures, you stop feeling like you've failed. Just because you can't do the things your neurotypical peers do so easily, it doesn't mean that you're not capable. It's very empowering to be able to play to your strengths. It really does take me half the time to do some of the things I see you take weeks to achieve. Yet I can spend hours deliberating over a 4-line email, a 4-sentence email, and it takes you 5 minutes. But together, put us together, and we make really good teams, really high-performing teams, and isn't that what all businesses want? In the ADHD brain, thanks to the chemical imbalance, the highs and lows of emotions are so exaggerated throughout the day. Yours are on a more even keel if you're neurotypical. But it's because of this, not in spite of, that we're incredibly perceptive, sensitive, and fearless. We don't see anything as impossible. There is always a solution to be found. We take risks, but we're also very considered. So we make really good risk managers and actuaries and lots of other professions. For constantly craving the next high, you'll see that we're your team members you see as a safe pair of hands. We're trusted to deliver and get on with the proactive self-starters. We might miss the subtle, but that just means we have to read the jokes twice before we get to the punchline. We don't see boundaries. We don't really care for hierarchies either. And it's because we see all these things so differently that we have no fear in addressing the elephant in the room. We nurture, we build relationships, and we know exactly when to pivot in our change projects. And next time, if you see somebody who can't maintain eye contact, keep in mind they may be struggling to process what they're hearing, as well as if they were trying to focus on what they're seeing. And when you judge performance, base it on abilities, not on the differences compared to their neurotypical peers. Thank you.
Thank you, Nalini. That was brilliant, and thanks for the insights into the workings of your wonderful brain. Really, really good. We're now going to hear from Adam Lane. Adam's an actuary and investment consultant, and Adam's going to share with us some thoughts on how to operate in the workplace before and after a diagnosis. Adam.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thank you all for joining us. I'm actually autistic and was diagnosed a little over 18 months ago, and I just wanted to share a bit of my personal story about how I ended up where I ended up, what it was like pre and post diagnosis. So I've always been considered a slightly kind of I guess the right word is a weird kid and then a weird grown-up, I guess. And the way that manifested in my younger life as well is, I think it's best described by how my mother used to describe parents' evening. She'd turn up and she would never quite know what she was going to get. I was either absolutely top of the class or bottom of the class. And frankly, my teachers never knew quite what to do with me. And I think that's, in hindsight, and some of my behaviours was clearly pointing towards neurodiversity, but it just wasn't the thing back then. It's fair to say I had a very tough kind of childhood and teenage years in terms of a conventional path through that. And I really kind of struggled ultimately, and really struggled to kind of hold down really very basic jobs. But due to some sort of intervention, I was lucky enough to find my calling in mathematics. And I went from, frankly, not being able to hold down a normal job to excelling and ultimately getting into this wonderful industry. And that's kind of been my experience throughout my working life, is that when I'm doing the right thing, I've tended to excel. But then in certain aspects of my role, I've really struggled. And work is inherently social in nature, and that's always kind of confused me. So where I was able to excel in analytical type roles, and in particular problem solving type roles, that was kind of often mitigated by my interaction with colleagues, but also navigating the system. So the way it kind of manifested for me again was kind of, I was promoted because of my technical ability, but then ultimately held back as I reached more senior levels when there was a need to kind of navigate the winks and nods of more modern organizations. And also, as I'm sure you'll appreciate as senior members of kind of different parts of this industry, kind of roles become more ambiguous and far less literal as you go through. And the things you're required to do and the relationships you're required to build are very challenging for someone who doesn't necessarily read between the lines. And there's kind of an expression, I think, isn't there, which is can't see the wood for the trees. And for me, at least, not only can I not see the wood, I can't see past the trees because I'm looking at the leaves and the bark, because I just can't get that big picture. And hence it just becomes extremely challenging. Ultimately, what led to my diagnosis was I was at a kind of stage in my career where I was going for a very senior promotion. I was in charge of a number of people, and what was required was a degree of politicking and navigating relationships and building networks. And I found it extraordinarily difficult and kept finding I was making mistakes and never really understood why. I went to part of an annual medical, and I was lucky enough to be kind of referred to a psychologist who initially was kind of skeptical that there was anything wrong with me, but within half an hour was pretty sure I was on the autistic spectrum. And frankly, that was kind of, it was life-changing to say the least. In terms of, in and of itself, the label wasn't super helpful, but kind of, it was as if the kind of, the mist had cleared and I'd finally kind of had something to understand what led me to have so many difficulties historically. And it's kind of difficult reaching that position, I think, because you've only got your own experience. So how do you know you think differently from other people? And it's only kind of through working with external people and being parts of groups like this, I was able to properly identify what was going on. And I just wanted to kind of share for people who aren't neurodiverse what it was like for me, just kind of on a day-to-day basis, almost within the workplace too. So what I hadn't appreciated, or let me talk more literally, when I walk into a workplace, it's extremely noisy. The fluorescent lights are extremely bright. I hear almost every single sound in that office. The need to talk to people and have small talk is extremely straining kind of psychologically, and it's just very, very tiring. And I thought that was the same for everyone, but it turns out that's not really the case. And I've come to understand that some people find that extremely energizing, while I always found it extremely draining. And I've had to try and find a way through that. And what always seemed to be the case with me is that I was able to excel from a technical sense, but then I had to overcompensate from a social sense. And that put large strains on me psychologically from an energy level, but also spilled out into my home life. So how it ended up working for me is I was trading off success in a relationship, social, home sense for success at work. And I've been going through a process of trying to find a more appropriate balance in terms of how do I be true to myself? How do I succeed in the workplace? But how do I do that in a way which frankly doesn't kind of lead to kind of very negative trade-offs in my personal life? And if you're to ask me, how do you do that? I don't have all the answers for you. This is very much a journey, as much for people who are new to this area as someone living through it. I guess that would be my message to you. I'm really passionate about this now in terms of finding the right balance, because in my experience, at least, and having worked now, been lucky enough to be involved with this group, but also a number of other neurodiverse individuals, is they have superpowers. I think that's somebody said that earlier on, in terms of if you can find and put these people in the right roles and find the right reasonable adjustments, they can have such large impacts on organizations, and you get it wrong and they can kind of flounder. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to find that as an industry to be really successful in the future. And I think we've got one more speaker, haven't we, Rob, after me?
We do indeed. We have, and thank you, Adam. That was really good. And you know, appreciate your candor in sort of sharing your experiences. Our final speaker is Jennifer Matthews, who is a compliance advisory professional, also the co-chair of the neurodiversity workstream with me. And Jennifer is going to share her thoughts on realising strengths and understanding limitations. Jennifer.
Thank you, Rob. So the first 15 years of my career, is actually painful to say that time frame as well, when I think back to it. So the first 15 years of my career, I was really well respected as a hard worker with a high level of integrity. And everybody seemed to sing my praises, but I was really struggling to progress with very little guidance as to why and what I needed to do. At first, it seemed to be largely due to social aspects, which I still think were played a part in that. Back then, it really helped if you played golf with the boss if you wanted to progress. Such was the culture. Thankfully, I think most people have moved on from that now. But in a desperate want to progress my career and to move forward, I started a very long and rather misguided attempt at developing myself by diversifying and just getting involved in as many things as absolutely possible. So things that I actually didn't enjoy, I felt like I needed to push myself, challenge myself, move out of my comfort zone to get involved in, and this is how I would move forward with my career. Ultimately, I became stressed and demoralised as a part of this, and I didn't end up moving forward at all. I was actually having challenges in my personal life at the time, and actually hearing from Adam just now, I wonder whether some of that was due to what was going on at work partly, and having a reflection on that and me struggling to find that balance. But due to challenges in my personal life and my relationships outside of work, I actually researched my autism diagnosis for the first time. Previous to this, I'd always attempted to be a normal person. You know, we heard from Ian and Laurie earlier about the problems with masking as a neurodivergent, and masking and trying to fit into a normal world. And I was certainly experiencing that then. So I was trying to get a better understanding of myself, and I looked up my autism diagnosis. Now, this was to do with my personal life, but it just so happened that an opportunity came up to lead on a project at my work. And this is something that I wouldn't have previously considered at all, as I felt like it would silo me. And actually, I took the opportunity, and when I took it, I was actually resigning myself to the fact that I was doing this because it was what I was good at. Being able to hyper focus on something, being detail orientated, concentrating on one particular thing. It was what I was good at, and I've resigned myself to the fact that this is just what I would have to do, but it would ultimately probably hinder my career and I'd never move forward, but at least I would be doing something that I was good at. I'm glad to say that I was totally wrong about it being career limiting. It really did enable me to utilise my strengths And my career finally took off. People inside and outside of the business were using me as a subject matter expert for the particular topic that the project was involved in. And my network grew. People were using me as a trusted advisor, and my mental health improved. I was no longer suffering from periods of autistic burnout. And I was actually, people were really recognizing me, saying that I was, you know, finally doing some great work and finally really putting the effort in. Ironically, I feel like I wasn't putting as much effort in as I was, but it was because I didn't have to. I was constantly burning myself into the ground, trying to diversify and do things that I wasn't actually good at. Whereas this was actually coming as a second nature to me, and something that I was actually enjoying a lot as well. Previously, as part of me becoming stressed and demoralized, as in my previous role, I was a kind of jack of all trades, master of none. I was actually looking into what I could do to manage that stress as well. And as part of that, I was looking into work-life balance, doing things like making sure I was scheduling frequent breaks and making sure I was leaving at work at 5 o'clock. Now, these probably do work for a lot of people, maybe even the majority of people. So I'm definitely not saying anything negative about those tactics and work-life balance, but it didn't work for me. It was just another case of it's not a one-size-fits-all. And actually, my stress and demoralization got worse as I was, I was breaking away from my hyper focus to actually take these breaks. And now I actually am able to work in a much more flexible way that allows me to harness that hyper focus. And when I can really bury myself into something and get involved in something, I don't notice the time passing by. I do have to set myself reminders if things need doing and remind myself to do things, but I'm able to, thanks to flexibility, have hyper focus on certain days, and then perhaps understand that the other days I won't actually be able to just work for 14 hours straight. So flexibility has really helped as well, and some of that has been circumstantial. Some good has come out of COVID, I think, in that we're actually become a lot more flexible within the financial services industry and within our careers. But ultimately, as a result of doing this project and being able to really realize and harness my superpowers and my strengths, I now will spend less time on doing the things that I would never be good at and focusing purely on where I can add that value. And as a people manager as well, I would definitely be looking at that with the people that I manage and making sure my team are actually able to harness their powers, because I know that I'm going to get the best from them and the most value. Where people add value, they're happy and the business is happy as well, ultimately. Thank you, Rob, back to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was that was great. I think, just everybody. I hope everybody sort of enjoyed, the listening to the insights of some of our workstream members. And I think a few points come out. The first is the importance of flexibility and to treat everybody as individuals. I think that's something that applies well beyond neurodiversity, but is probably particularly helpful. The focus on abilities rather than what people can't do, and to reward and offer opportunities to subject matter experts, not experts at internal politics and networking. So yeah, hopefully you've all got a sort of better sense of some of the benefits of neurodiversity. There have been some very, very kind messages to our speakers on the chat. I'm looking through now. I think we've just got time for a couple of questions that were in the chat that I think maybe actually, if I could bring in Ian very quickly, there might be a couple that are relevant to you. One is from Anne Baird, who wants to know how to help staff who suspect they may be neurodiverse but have not been diagnosed, and refers to the sort of challenge in getting assessed especially through the NHS. Just wondered if you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, as ever with all of this, there's a lot to say, and I'm conscious of shorter time. Getting a formal assessment is difficult. There's a bit of a postcode lottery in terms of where you are in the country with the NHS. It can take years rather than months to get a diagnosis, so that's problematic. As a first instance, if there's a person or a colleague who's looking to find out more information, there is a lot online that people can find. Some of it I've got my own website I've set up called autisminwork.com, where it has links to lots of the other organizations. So just finding out information can be helpful. Talking to others, if there's anybody else that you know that is formally diagnosed, that can be really helpful. There are also some online self-assessment diagnostic tools, which aren't obviously as robust as a formal face-to-face assessment, but there's one or two that are very, very powerful and can have a high level of predictability. So if someone's really desperate to find out more, they could take one of those. And then at the end of the day, it's just finding out information and learning what you can. And as I said, there are a lot of places you can go. There are a lot of organizations that are now set up, both charities and social enterprises, to support both the employee and the employer understand each other better. So also speaking to some of them can be very, very useful.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. We do have a few other questions, but I think given that we're almost out of time, I think what we'll do is we will we'll basically come together as a group, all the sort of panelists today, and we will do our best to sort of reach out to all the people individually who've shared their comments. So I just want to say just a final thank you to our speakers, to Ian, to Laurie, David, Nalini, Adam and Jennifer. A special thank you also to Jenny Fenton and Caroline Golshan for their help in putting this webinar together, and a final thanks to everybody who's joined the session. We really do appreciate your time. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the day.